Hi, my name's Dan. I'm from Clock Shop, and today I just wanted to run through a range of different battery movements that we have. We've got lots and lots of people asking questions about which is the right movement for their clock. So the first thing we're going to go through is the hand length. So you might be changing the movement in an existing clock, or maybe you're wanting to make your own clock. But the first thing to consider is how long is your minute hand. So there's kind of a general rule. If your minute hand is over 150, 160 mil or 15, 16 centimeters, it's best practice to use a high torque movement. So that's geared a little bit differently to drive longer and heavier hands. Under that size, we work through a range of different movements. I'm going to go through the differences now with you today. So the first and most common type of movement is what's considered a press fit movement. So press fit hands are push-on hands like this that have a round hole for both the minute and the hour hand, and they just push on using friction onto the end of the movement. Both hands push onto the shaft, so your hour hand pushes on first, your minute hand pushes on second, but both are just held on with friction. The other style of movement is known as a Euro shaft or an I shaft. So the hour hand is the same, it has a round hole and it pushes on to the hour shaft, but the minute hand has a slotted hole. So it actually has two flat sides in the hole that have to line up with the same shape on the end of the movement. So you can't push on a round hand onto a Euro shaft or an I shaft movement, it won't work. So you have to find either the right movement to suit your hands, or you may have to replace your hands if you need a Euro shaft movement. So once you've worked out which movement you need, whether it's initially a high torque movement or a regular movement, and then if it's a press fit shaft or an Euro shaft or an I shaft movement, the next thing to establish is how long does your shaft need to be. Now this is quite important for a number of reasons, and one I'll explain a little bit later in this video. But the shaft length essentially correlates to the thickness of the dial. So the material that your movement is going through from behind the clock, it has to come through the dial, and then you fit your hands on the front. So you can see between these two, you would be working with something that's quite thin, maybe a piece of glass or metal, or maybe you've got a slab of timber or something that's quite thick in the dial. Then you'll need to find the relevant shaft length for your clock. These shaft lengths apply to all the different types of movements. However, there is limited shaft options for high torque movements. When you're working out your shaft length, the required shaft length, one of the critical aspects is to consider if your clock that you're replacing the movement in has glass on the front. So the distance between the front of the dial and the glass, because if your shaft is too long, it's going to go through and it's going to touch the glass on the end, and that'll stop your clock from running. Your hands won't be able to turn around. So sometimes it's easiest to remove your existing movement and actually get some measurements of these various different sections, so this thread length or the overall shaft length, and to compare them. They're not always the same. From different manufacturer to different manufacturer, you've got different thread lengths, and the actual length of the hour shaft and the minute shaft can also be different. So there isn't a one size fits all, and that's why we're going through this information today. On our listings online, we measure the shaft length as the total shaft length. So from the body of the clock movement to the very end of the shaft. So we're measuring from here right to the very tip. So in this case, you would be measuring from the body of the clock right through, so from the black casing right to the end of the shaft, not the thread length. However, we do specify in our listings what dial thickness a movement is suited towards. In this instance, this would suit a 15 to 16 mil dial, because this threaded section is about 18 mil and you have a little hex nut that goes on the end. So we do give you some guidelines in terms of the dial thickness. So that's the thickness of the material that you're going through from the back of the clock through to the front. Now sometimes, in some cases, if it's a heavy timber clock or something like that, it may be recessed into the back of the wood. So it's important to measure the section where the actual shaft goes through the clock, not the thickness at the outside. If it's recessed in, you need to measure where the shaft actually goes through the clock. Okay, so I'm just going to demonstrate changing the movements in a couple of different clocks, but firstly I wanted to show you an example of where a high torque movement would be required. So this is the minute hand, this is what we're going to measure. Now in this case we always want to measure from the center of the hand to the very tip. So this one measures around 23 centimeters or 230 mils. So as I said earlier on, anything over 150, 160 mil, it's because of the weight of the hand, and when it gets around to the 6 and driving that weight back up to the hour, you need to use a high torque movement. So they're geared a little bit differently to actually drive the heavier hands. And you can get hands that are up to 1/2 meter in length, and we have a range of those on our website. Okay, so we're going to go through changing a movement in this clock. So we've got glass on the front here. So first of all, we've got to get into the clock. There's a number of different styles of clocks, and there'll be different methods to get into them. Some you have to unscrew a frame. This one has clips that I've already removed off the back, but essentially we've got to get the actual clock out of the frame carefully, because it's actually glass, it's not an acrylic, because we have to access the hands to be able to release the movement. So I'll put the glass to the side in the frame. So this is what we end up with. Now you need to pay attention to how the hands are fixed to your clock. If you have a Euro shaft movement, your minute hand will always be fixed with a little nut, but generally the second hand is always just a push on. So the second hand will always just pull off regardless of what type of shaft you have. Now this one I can see here doesn't have any nut on the front, so this is what we described earlier as a press fit movement. So the hands are held on with friction and they just simply pull off. Then we have a little hex nut on the front here that we have to loosen. Now you may need some pliers, there's no special tools required. You remove your little nut and it'll have a washer there, and then the movement will actually come free from the clock, and it has a little rubber washer in the back here that actually stops the movement from rotating. This one's housed in the back here, which also helps to stop it moving around. So once we've got our movement out, then we can start looking at the movement. We recognize the type of shaft that the movement has, and then we can also measure what's required here. So the overall shaft length, which is relevant in this case because it has a glass. If we go too long, it's going to go through and touch the glass, but also this thread length, because we need to be able to fix the little hex nut when we go back on the front. Now in some cases you may find that you can't get exactly the same movement. So there's a number of different sizes to even the press fit movements. So the diameter of the minute hand shaft, the round little shaft at the end, and the hour hand shaft, which is next. Now we carry the most common size, which is 3.5 mil diameter and 5.5 mil diameter. But there are other variations where it's 3 and 5, and sometimes it's 3.5 at the front and 5 behind. You just have to work with what you've got, and if we can't supply the right movement, well, you can always buy new hands to suit our movements. So in this case, what I'm going to do is going to find one of our movements to swap over. And in this instance, I'm just going to have a quick look at the shaft length, so I can see that it's not going to be any longer to come through. Essentially, we put the movement back into the clock. We have to fix it with the little hex nut. You don't want to do it too tight, otherwise you can put a little bit of tension on the actual movement at the back. So finger tight, you can use some pliers just to carefully tighten it up a little bit, and then the hands push back on. Now the easiest way is to line all your hands up at 12 o'clock. So because they're friction fit, if you need to move the hands, you can just simply line them up with the 12, and then the second hand, or the sweep hand as it's sometimes known as well, will push on the end also. Now the other thing to consider when you're changing your movement is to make sure, it's going to be a little bit difficult to see in this instance because of the outside of the frame here, but to make sure that the hands are all parallel to each other. If you push the second hand on and maybe you push on this end, it will sweep around and touch on the end of the minute hand, and then it'll stop your clock. So it's important to make sure that there's a space and all the hands are parallel with a nice little gap between. It may only be a millimeter or so, but they need to be able to spin around and not touch each other. And it simply goes back inside the frame. I'd put the clips in to secure it, and you've changed your movement. Put your battery in and reset the time. Okay, so now we're going to change a different style movement. This one is the Euro shaft, or the I shaft with the slotted hands. On the end here you'll find it has a closed minute hand nut. Now in some cases people are not familiar with what that is, and they'll try and remove the hand with the nut still on, and it'll actually just pull the inside out of the movement, completely wrecks the movement. So if you're unsure, it's probably best to see if you can actually screw this off. So I'll go through this practice now. This one wasn't too tight, so I could actually get it off with my fingers. We've got the closed minute hand nut, and then this is the hand that has the slotted hole in the middle. And then the hour hand is a friction fit, so it just pushes onto the shaft. Now this particular movement has a collar that fixes the movement into place, and it screws back through the dial into the movement. So what we have to do is we have to unscrew that collar, and that will release the movement from the back. Now this particular collar has two slotted, kind of like a screwdriver slot in it, and some of them just have a single one. You can remove it just with a screwdriver. Just need to spin it around carefully, and you can see the movement actually just dropped out of the back in this case. It didn't have any adhesive or double-sided tape or anything on the movement here, and this collar will actually come out of the clock, and you'll see that that's what actually holds that in place. So this style of movement, this is a German movement made by a company, UTS. Now they brand their movements both Hermle and Junghans as well as UTS, and we carry those in stock here. So this one here, we're looking at the shaft length. It has a really long shaft, however it doesn't have any glass on the front of the clock, so if we end up getting too long a shaft, it's not going to interfere with the front of the clock. What it will mean is that the hands will sit a little bit further proud in front of the dial. Now in many cases that's not a problem, it's just an aesthetic, but it is important, again, if you have glass on your clock, that you remember that you need to adhere to the shaft length that's in the clock. Okay, so we've removed the original movement from the clock. We've got the replacement here. Now the original collar, because it's a movement that comes from the same factory, so it's a UTS movement, it's going to actually fit, and you can test this. So it's a good practice to actually test everything before you actually try and mount it in your clock. You can also test a movement with the hands, so you can put the hands on and make sure it's all working if you're unsure. So this one has to go through the back of the clock. So once we've actually got the clock movement inserted from the back, we can screw the collar up to the movement. Just gently tighten that up into position, and then we can fit our hands. So the hour hand always pushes on first. Easiest to line it up with the 12 position. Now in this case we've got to get the minute hand to actually line up with the profile of the minute hand shaft, and it's about at 10-2, so when we actually bring it up to the 12 position, the hour hand's going to be out of position, so we just have to move that back. It's a friction fit, and once they're lined up we can actually screw on our little hand nut on the end. And we can set the time. Quick recap of what we've gone through today. So firstly, we just determined which type of movement we need, whether it's a standard movement or a high torque movement. And again, this is based on the length of the hand. So a longer hand like this behind here, you'll need a high torque movement. So once you've established high torque or not high torque, then you can work out whether you have a press fit shaft, which is just a round shaft for both the minute and the hour hand, or whether you need a Euro shaft movement where you actually have to hold on the hand with a little nut on the end. So we've got two different types of movements, press fit, Euro shaft. And then once you've determined which type of movement in terms of the hands, then you have to work out the shaft length. So you might be going for something quite short, depending on the material that you're actually going through, the dial thickness, or you might need a longer shaft, something that's quite long like this. Lastly, one thing to consider also that I haven't gone through is either a step movement, which is also known as a ticking movement, where your second hand will tick. Now some of the movements are very, very quiet, but they are still considered a step movement. And if you put it up to your ear, you will hear a tick. So if you're very, very sensitive, you may wish to consider a sweep movement, where the second hand or the sweep hand simply just has a continual sweep around the dial and it doesn't make any sound. Thank you for watching. I hope you found the video useful, helpful if you're doing some repairs. Now if you're looking for particular products, anything we've gone through here and a bigger range, please look in our description below. We have a full suite of products on our website at clockshop.com.au.